All right, confirmation class. Did I get all the lights on? All right, that's good enough. If you can hear me, clap once. Hear me, clap twice. You can hear me, clap 3 times. Welcome back to confirmation class. How was Christmas break for everybody? Good? Kind of good? You guys don't seem too enthusiastic about Christmas break. Did you have a good time? All right, I'll take it. That'll work. So, let's see. It's been a while. It has been a while since we talked about things other than Christmas break, and then also we had the service night, we had the fun night, all these things going on. Does anybody remember what we're talking about in confirmation? Okay, let's start with the basics. Yeah. New Testament? No, Old Testament. Yes, great. Okay, so we're on the right track. Old Testament, yes? We were in Genesis. Did we end in Genesis? No. We jumped into a new book, the second book of the Bible. Anyone remember what the second book of the Bible is called? Gavin? Exodus, yes. Does anybody remember what Exodus means? Keenan? Sure. Exit, yes, it means exit, exiting. So why is the book of Exodus called something that means exit? Do you remember one of the stories we talked about? Guy named Moses. Last time we talked about Old Testament stuff, they did an exit. Anybody remember anything about the story of Moses? No. Hey, yes, back here. He parted the Red Sea. That's right. That's something he did, and we'll review a little bit of that later on as well. Where were God's people that Moses needed to exit with them out of? Egypt. Yes, that's right. And why did they need to exit Egypt? I thought Egypt was a pretty cool place to be. Yes. Pharaoh was kind of being a jerk, right? The Hebrew people, the Israelite people, were enslaved, right? You remember this whole thing? Because Pharaoh had gotten kind of afraid because the people of Israel had started getting more and more numerous, right? They had started outnumbering the Egyptians. So he said, okay, that's not okay. We're going to enslave all you and force you to do our work. And he did something else, too, that was very much uncool. Anybody remember what that was? It's why Moses ended up in a river basket. Yes, he passed a law that killed all of the male Israelite children. Very not cool. And so Moses' mother puts him in a basket to try to escape this crime or this law that was passed. And who finds him? You remember? Yes. Pharaoh's daughter. Pharaoh's daughter finds the baby Moses and ends up raising him in the royal family of the Egyptian Pharaoh. And so then as he becomes an adult, whole bunch of stuff happens. We're going to shortcut that all because we got a lot to talk about. He ends up taking the Israelites, after convincing Pharaoh, took a long time, out of Egypt. They do this whole cool thing. We talked a little bit about it really briefly, where he parts the Red Sea, right? Like Pharaoh's coming up and Pharaoh changes his mind and says, actually, I want to keep you guys enslaved, so I'm going to bring my army and chase you down. And God allows Moses to part the Red Sea. The Israelites cross the Red Sea to the other side, and Moses' army kind of gets splashed with the ocean, and they all drown, right? You guys remember that story? We didn't talk about it, but you might have heard it in other stories of the Bible, that kind of thing. It's kind of a big deal in the book of Exodus. Well, tonight, we're going to kind of go beyond the book of Exodus that we've been on, because the story of the Hebrew people certainly does not end once they make it across the Red Sea to the other side. There's more that happens with the story. Because when they make it across the ocean, when they make it across to safety on the other side of the Red Sea, turns out there's nothing actually there. They're kind of in the middle of the desert, right? And is the middle of the desert a good place to be if you don't have anything to survive with? No, it is not. It is not a very hospitable place, especially for a huge group of people, including kids and elderly and all kinds of folks. Not a great place to be. And so the people turn to Moses, who's up there in that rock, and they say, okay, Moses, we've been following you. We followed you away from Egypt. You've done a great job guiding us with God across the ocean. But now what are we going to do? We're in the middle of nowhere. And the people start doubting the fact that God was going to help them. Up until now, God has been faithful, and they recognize that, but man, we're in the middle of the desert, nothing's happening. What in the world are we going to do? So God is with them still and ends up sending a number of things to help them out. The very first thing that God sends them is something that we might remember. God sends them the law in the form of 10 laws. Anyone know what those 10 laws might have been? The 10 Commandments, right. We get Moses, you see the picture up there holding the tablets, which is kind of how they're traditionally depicted. He gives them the 10 Commandments, ways to live in community with each other and with God. These are ways, God says to Moses, that you will be able to live lives that are better than if you don't have them. They are ways to be in community and taking care of each other and loving God and all of these things that are good. And so follow these laws and everything will be great. Okay, the people say, well, follow the laws that you gave us, but we still don't have any food. What are we going to do? We can't eat stone tablets. So, does anybody know what God does in the middle of the desert to provide the Israelites food? He gives them something called manna. What's that? That's a great question, Pastor Brigitte. It is some stuff that we really don't know what it is, but it just appears on the ground every day. You can see picture up there. The other half of that picture is people that are kind of like gathering this fluffy, bready stuff that they found on the ground. This was something that God provided them that the Israelites called manna, and together with some birds and quails and other things that they found and hunted, God provided them food that they needed to survive in the time in the desert. He also provided them with water, also a really important thing to have in the desert. And so even though the people were kind of doubting the promises of God, God continued to be faithful to them. God continued to walk alongside them. Do you think that was enough for the people? Not really. In fact, they still kept having these issues where they kept doubting and wondering and kind of thinking, oh man, God, he's had our back so long, but it's not going to keep going. And so they kept having these problems of doubting the promises that God had for them. Well, it got to the point where they ended up having to spend a lot of time in the wilderness, and we'll kind of learn a little bit more about that. But it got to the point where they needed someone else to guide them as well, because they spent so long in the desert that we had someone besides Moses that became their leader. And this was a guy named Joshua. Has anybody ever heard about Joshua in the Bible before? Some hands, maybe not. Teresa has. Yes, we've had a few people. Has anybody heard the song Joshua Fit the Battle of Jericho? Some of you have, yes. So this is a song about this whole big battle that happens with Joshua at a city named Jericho. We'll learn about that too. But Joshua becomes the leader of the people after Moses dies. And the next book that we're going to jump into is actually named after him, the book of Joshua. Tonight we're going to be talking about the book of Joshua as well as the book of Judges that we'll get into a little bit after that. But just to give you kind of a Cliff Notes version of the story of Joshua and his rise to leadership, let's watch the video that is next queued up here.
God's story. Joshua becomes leader. So part of God's story is about when Joshua became leader of God's family, and it goes like this. Remember how God rescued his family when they were stuck as slaves in Egypt? He made a path right through the middle of the Red Sea. He showed them where to go with a pillar of fire at night and a cloud during the day. He gave them water from rocks and sent food like rain every morning. Best of all, he promised to bring them to an amazing new home called Canaan. All they had to do was trust him. But sometimes people have a hard time believing God will take care of them. So for a whole year, God's family worried and complained. They felt like they'd never get to the promised home where they would be safe and comfortable. And even though God was taking care of them every day, they kept worrying that he'd stop. But their leader Moses trusted God with his whole heart. And one day, God told Moses to send 12 men into Canaan as spies to see how great it was. So Moses did. And one of those 12 men was Moses' helper, Joshua. He trusted God too. Well, Joshua and the other spies spent 40 days in Canaan, and they discovered that the new home was as good as God had promised. There was delicious food, water flowed nearby, it was paradise. It had everything God's family needed and wanted. There was just one teeny tiny problem. People lived there already. big people. Big people who lived in a big city called Jericho that was protected with really big, strong walls. And the people there did not plan to give up their home. So 10 of the spies came back terrified. They said, "We look like grasshoppers compared to the people there." When the rest of God's family heard that, they got scared too. They didn't want to go to the promised land anymore. But Joshua knew that no problem is too big for God. He and another spy named Caleb argued, "If the Lord wants to give it to us, he will." After all, God had shown his family how powerful he was. But even though God had always provided for his family, they still chose not to trust him. And because they made that choice, there was a consequence. God kept his whole family in the desert for 39 more years. So long that all the adults who chose not to trust that God could take them to the new land spent the rest of their lives in the wilderness. God kept taking care of them, of course, but life was nothing like it would have been in the promised home. The good news is, there was a blessing for Joshua and Caleb's obedience. They did live long enough to get to Canaan. See, God always keeps his promises. So eventually, he took his family into the promised land, and God chose a new leader to take them there, a guy who would trust him with his whole heart like Moses had. Yep, Joshua. And that's the story of when Joshua became the leader of God's family. So in case you missed it, here's the quick version. God took care of his family. He promised them a new home. They had to trust him. 12 spies visited Canaan. People already lived there. Joshua and Caleb trusted God. Most of God's family got scared. God's family stayed in the desert. God kept his promise. Joshua got ready to lead God's family into the promised land. And that's a part of God's story.
All right, so that's kind of the story, at least the beginning part of the story of this guy named Joshua. The whole book of Joshua really talks more about. So Joshua is the one who takes over after Moses, right? And eventually leads the people of Israel into that promised land, the land of Canaan. After they spent how long in the wilderness again? Did you guys catch that? It started off as a year. It was more than a year though at the end though, right? How long? 39 more years, for a total of 40 is what the Bible says. So they were in the wilderness for a very long time. But eventually, Joshua, led by God, leads them into Canaan, and they actually do take it. And it becomes the land that they inhabit, the land that they live in. Now, once Joshua and the Israelites get into the promised land, and they get to that land where everything was good, and you saw all the great food they had and all that stuff, that was the time when everyone started trusting God all the time, right? Right? No. No. See, that's the whole thing, is that it kept being a problem, right? This problem of God supporting the people and the people still not really trusting God continued. This was a problem that happened again and again and again. See, this problem really wasn't just about the people who were there with Moses and Joshua. It goes back to that thing that we call sin, right? Does anybody remember that word that we've talked about, what sin is? What is sin? Yeah. Never mind. Okay. Anyone remember what the word sin means? Yeah. When you go against the 10 Commandments, that would be an example of sin. Yeah. Yeah, back here. Lies, also an example of sin, for sure. Lies are an example of sin. Sin at its core level is really anything that leads us to not trust God, right? And not do what God calls us to be and who God calls us to be, right? And so the problem of people not trusting God really wasn't about them individually. It's about sin, the thing that is part of all of our lives. And so what happened was that the people of Israel started into kind of a cycle, right? Where they would have God help them in some way, like God did with Joshua, and then they'd be celebrating because God helped us out and everything was good, and then things would be good for a while, but then they'd kind of stop trusting God, and they'd kind of start falling back into sin and falling away, and then things would get really bad, and then the people would say, "Oh, God, please save us, send us something to help us," and God would take care of them, and things would be good for a while, and they'd be really thankful. But then they'd start to fall away again and not trust God and get sad, and then things would get bad. And this cycle continued over and over again. Now, the solution that ended up happening was that God would bring people into the lives of the Israelites that he called judges. Now, when you guys think of a judge, what do you guys think of? Who's a judge? What's a judge in our world? Judge Judy. Yeah, maybe he looks, maybe not exactly like this, but kind of like this, right? A judge sitting in front of a courtroom with a big old gavel hammering away, someone who interprets law, right? That's what we think of when we think of judges. In the Bible, that's not what a judge is. The book of Judges in the Bible isn't really about people with gavels and courtrooms and that kind of thing. Judges, and this is one of your vocab words, judges were people who were raised up by God to set things right. They were leaders of the people that were empowered by God to help them in times when they needed him. These are people like Samson. Have you guys ever heard of Samson before? Yeah, Samson was really strong, right? And he led his people in a time when they had been conquered by an enemy, and he was sent to help protect them and free them from their conquerors. Now, there were other judges too, people like Deborah, people like Eli, and this whole cycle wrote around these judges who would be sent by God to help people in their time of need, right? And things would be good for a while, but then they would fall away again, and they would continue this cycle. Now, this is something called the judge's sin cycle that we see again and again and again in the book of Judges, kind of like what I'm talking about, right? That there's good things that are happening, and then there's a crisis because people have fallen into idolatry, immorality. Then they cry out to God for a deliverer. God sends a judge to deliver them, and things are good. But then they fall away again and get into this cycle of difficulty, this cycle of sin. And God starts to realize this really isn't a good long-term solution, right? We have this book of Judges that shows the cycle happening over and over again. And God says, we need something different. I keep sending these judges, these helpers, but it's not actually solving the problem. Sin continues to be a problem. I need to find another way, which eventually leads us to not the Old Testament, but the New Testament, with the rescuer of Jesus, right? Who eventually is the one comes and deals with that whole problem of sin at its root. But in the book of Judges, we see this cycle over and over again. Now, this is something that we're going to get into a little bit in your small groups, and you're going to learn a little bit about that. But I wanted to go run through your other vocab words here. So we talked about judges, right? The judges were people raised up by God to set things right. Something else, the word conquest. You guys know what conquest is? I mean, it's not just a Bible word, right? It's something that happens a lot other times, too, in history. Yeah. Going on an adventure. Sometimes an adventure will lead to a conquest. That certainly happened with the people of Israel. Yeah. Yes, to acquire something by force is the definition we're going to use here. Now, conquest was how the people of Israel got Canaan, right? They conquered it from those people who were already there, but then they also got conquered a whole bunch too. That's what happens with the judges coming back, is often it's because other peoples had come in and conquered them, and they needed to be set free from that conquest. It's also part of this cycle of sin, because conquering things is itself kind of a sin, right? Where you force other people to be displaced because you want what they have. That's also not really how God wants us to live. And so that is part of that sin cycle as well. For the people of Israel, both conquering and getting conquered, leading to a lot of pain that exists in the world. Now, the other vocab word we have is kind of tied to that, right? Immorality. What do we got over here? This is a very clinical definition, yes. An act opposed to a moral principle. What in the world does that mean? Does anybody have any definition that makes more sense than that? I got to change that one of these years because that is such a dry definition. I'll kind of explain this a little bit. So, a moral principle. Let's start there. What is a moral principle? If I say, I think that lying is wrong, that's a moral principle, right? I'm saying that I think it is a moral thing to tell the truth. And so if I act in opposition to that, if I tell lies instead of the truth, I'm acting in an immoral way. right? So anytime I'm acting against what God wants me to do, it's kind of another way of understanding sin, right? Immorality, acting in opposition or opposing a moral principle like truth or love or kindness. So that's one of your vocab words as well, immorality. So, before I excuse you to your small groups, let us ask that question that we always ask. What does this mean, Martin Luther's question? Why is it important that the book of Judges is there? The cycle of sin, we read about that in that book. We hear about the people that Joshua is leading. Why are these things important for us now? What do they tell us about our own lives? Any ideas? Any ideas at all? Do you think that sin still has power over us, even though, we are saved from sin, right? We are saved from the consequence of it. Was that? Absolutely, right? Yeah. We still have our own sin cycle in our lives. We still have that same thing that the people in the book of Judges dealt with all the time in our own individual lives, in our community lives. These are things that we have to kind of deal with ourselves. And so it's important for us to understand that that's part of the human condition. That's part of the life that we share together that God calls us to recognize and understand so that we can learn to better trust him and learn to trust the love that he has for us, and we can live that out in the world. All right, so tonight in your small groups, you'll learn a little bit more about some of the judges, you'll learn more about Joshua, and then you guys can have a good time there. So, you may go to your small groups. Have a wonderful night.